It was a day like no other. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, promising a storm as I prepared for yet another funeral. Being the cemetery manager, I had seen it all: tears, emotional farewells, and sometimes that heavy silence that only a funeral can bring. But that day was different. Antonio's father was being buried. Antonio was a humble young man, known by everyone in the neighborhood, and his father was a simple but well-loved man. The entire family was there, trying to hold it together under the weight of loss and the weather that seemed to be working against them. As I organized the ceremony, making sure all the details were in place, something felt off. A strange sensation, like I was being watched, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the wind and the smell of wet earth making me uneasy. The storm began, and as it picked up, the wind made the tree branches bend, and the rain started to pour heavily. That's when I felt it again. Something or someone was there watching. I discreetly looked around, trying to find what was making me uncomfortable. And then I saw it. A figure at the far end of the cemetery, standing still, like they were attending the funeral from a distance. It was a tall man, dressed in black, but there was something about him that didn't seem right. He wasn't moving, he didn't react to the wind, and somehow it felt like his gaze was fixed directly on me. I blinked, and he was gone. I must be imagining things, I thought. I forced myself to focus on the ceremony, but that feeling wouldn't leave me. You know that sensation of being watched, even when there's no one around? It was like that, only 10 times stronger. I looked at the swaying trees, the falling rain, and suddenly, that place, that cemetery I knew so well, felt strange, hostile. At the end of the funeral, as people were leaving, I walked closer to the grave. The wind was howling now, like it carried whispers from another world. When I bent down to adjust the flowers on the coffin, I heard something. A laugh? Or was it a cry? Couldn't tell. I looked around again, trying to find the source of that sound, but all I saw were the tombstones. And, in the distance, a shadow slipping behind one of them. The feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me for the rest of the day. And I knew that night, as I left the cemetery and locked the gates, I would go home with that weight on my shoulders. The weight of knowing that, amidst the rain and mourning, something or someone was watching. When night came and the cemetery finally quieted down, I closed the iron gate and headed home. But the truth is, I couldn't forget what happened at that funeral. That figure I had seen, and the laugh that seemed woven into the wind. Something told me that the night would be long. And I was right. It was nearly midnight when I heard the first sound. A distant creak, like something scraping against the cemetery gate. I stood still, trying to figure out if it was just my mind playing tricks on me after such a strange day. But then I heard it again, louder, clearer. It sounded like someone scratching the iron, trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check it out. The gate was there, locked, just as I had left it. But when I looked inside, at that vast field of tombstones covered in darkness, I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything seemed calm, but I knew I wasn't alone. I shone the flashlight into the far corners, searching for any sign of movement, but all I saw was the marble of the gravestones reflecting the light. I closed the gate again and went back home, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But the noise continued. It was as if someone was circling around the outside of the cemetery, pacing back and forth, waiting for me to leave. I started to hear muffled footsteps on the dirt, coming from all directions, and then an even more disturbing sound. A slow, steady knocking on my house window. I knew I needed to look, but my body froze. Finally, I gathered the courage and walked to the window, holding the flashlight like it was my only protection. When I opened the curtain, I felt my heart stop for a second. On the other side of the glass, in the darkness of the night, was a face. A pale face with empty eyes, as if it had been waiting for me. It was him. It was Antonio's father. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me. It felt like his gaze pierced through the night, through the glass, and right into my soul. The flashlight shook in my hand, and I couldn't look away. It was like he was trapped between the world of the living and the dead, wanting wanting to say something. But before I could do anything, he vanished. In the blink of an eye, the face was gone, and all that was left was my own terrified reflection in the glass. The night went silent again, but I knew he was out there watching me, and I couldn't understand why. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those empty eyes, as if he were searching for something in me. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted, like I had carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. But the worst was yet to come. The wind that had howled during the funeral, the storm that seemed to bring a presence with it, all of that had stopped. The morning was cold, but calm. I tried to go about my routine, putting that nightmare of the previous night behind me, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like a constant shadow, lurking with every move I made. I decided to return to the cemetery, as if I needed to prove to myself that I was safe, that it had all just been in my imagination. As I walked through the gates, the place seemed normal. The morning sun made the tombstones shine, and the trees swayed gently with the breeze. But as I approached Antonio's father's grave, something caught my attention. The flowers that had been left there the day before were scattered across the ground, as if they'd been ripped out and thrown carelessly. Which was strange, because I was sure that when I left the cemetery the day before, they were intact. The soil around the grave seemed disturbed, like someone had been digging in it, but there were no signs of tools or footprints, just that inexplicable chaos. And then I heard it again. Those sounds, low whispers like murmurs, coming from all directions. The wind carried words I couldn't understand, a low lament, almost a cry, or a muffled laugh. Couldn't tell. My eyes scanned the cemetery, trying to find something, anything that could explain that sound. And then I saw it. Behind a tombstone, not too far from Antonio's father's grave, there was something or someone. A shadow just standing there, lurking. The same figure from the night before, now in the daylight. I slowly approached, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it pulsing in my throat. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking against some invisible force. When I finally got close enough to see more clearly, the shadow vanished. Just disappeared, as if it had never been there. In that moment, something fell to the ground right in front of me. A red rose. It simply appeared, as if someone had left it there for me. I looked around, but there was no one. Just me, the cold tombstone, and that rose, which seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. I picked up the flower, and the thorn pricked my finger, causing a drop of blood to stain its red petals. I dropped the rose and backed away, my whole body trembling. Whatever was happening, whatever that presence was, it wasn't just following me. It wanted to involve me, to pull me into this mystery. I knew this was only the beginning, and that Antonio's father wouldn't find peace anytime soon. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at that rose lying on the cold ground. The drop of blood on its petals seemed to grow, like it was being absorbed by the flower, turning the red even darker, more intense. My mind was spinning, trying to find a logical explanation for everything, but nothing made sense. It was as if the line between the world of the living and the dead was unraveling before my eyes, and I was the only one who could see it. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore it all. I went to the cemetery as usual, but kept my distance from Antonio's father's grave. If I could just act like nothing had happened, maybe I could go back to normal. But every time I glanced at that part of the cemetery, I felt a presence. No matter where I was, I knew he was there, watching me, waiting. One afternoon, Antonio showed up. He came to visit his father's grave, and I watched from a distance, hidden behind some trees. Antonio seemed calmer than I expected, considering everything that had happened. He placed fresh flowers on the grave and muttered a few words I couldn't hear. I wasn't sure if I should approach, if I should tell him about what I had seen, but deep down I knew it was useless. How could I explain that his deceased father was haunting me? Antonio stayed there for a while in silence, and I felt like I should leave, let him have that moment. But then, something strange happened. The light breeze that was blowing suddenly gained strength. The dry leaves around the cemetery began swirling, and a low sound, like a sigh, echoed through the place. I looked at Antonio, and he seemed to notice none of it. To him, everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. Suddenly, he turned to leave, and something caught his attention. The rose I had left on the ground, the same one I had touched and seen absorb my blood, was there, right beside the grave, as if it had been placed there delicately. He picked it up, looked at it with a confused expression, and then tossed it away, as if it were something dirty, cursed. The moment the rose hit the ground, the wind abruptly stopped. Silence enveloped the place, a silence so dense it felt like it surrounded me completely. Antonio quickly left, as if he wanted to get away from that place as fast as possible. And there I was, alone again, with the whole cemetery around me and that feeling, that certainty that the connection between Antonio's father and me was stronger than I ever imagined. He didn't want to scare me. No, it was something deeper, something that wanted to pull me into his story, to involve me in something I couldn't yet understand. And I began to realize that this connection wasn't just a haunting. It was a plea for help, a desperate attempt to communicate something he couldn't say in life. But what was it? And why me? Those questions followed me, haunted me, and I knew that until I found the answers, that presence wouldn't leave me alone. That feeling of being followed wouldn't leave, not during the day, not at night. I could no longer ignore it. The presence of Antonio's father was becoming part of my routine, a constant shadow around me. It seemed like he wanted to tell me something, but I didn't know how to listen. The rose, the apparitions, the wind carrying whispers. It was like a dark puzzle I needed to solve. One night, after another unsettling day at the cemetery, I was home, sitting in the dark, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. Everything was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, reminding me that time was passing, but the fear remained. Then, out of nowhere, a noise came from the direction of the back door, a soft but insistent knock. Once, twice, 3 times. I stood up slowly, feeling my heart pound in my chest, and went to the door. I knew it was him. Even before looking, I knew. I opened the door, and on the other side was darkness, the emptiness of the backyard. But when I looked down, I saw it. On the ground, right in front of me, was something that made me shiver. A small silver medal, covered in dirt and worn with age. I picked up the medal, trying to make sense of what I was holding. As I wiped it clean with my hand, I saw that a name was engraved on it. Antonio. My stomach churned. I had never seen that medal before, and I didn't know how it had ended up there, but it seemed to be connected to Antonio's father, or to Antonio himself. And then came the shock. That medal was identical to the one Antonio had worn since childhood. Something he always carried with him. It was as if it had been placed there on purpose, for me to find. I knew I needed to go back to the cemetery. I knew that, somehow, Antonio's father was trying to lead me to something, to show me something that was hidden in plain sight. With the medal in hand, I ran outside and headed to the cemetery, guided only by the pale moon and the fear burning in my chest. When I arrived, I went straight to Antonio's father's grave. The wind was cold, biting, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I started digging with my trembling hands around the grave, pushing away the soil and tearing at the roots of the shrubs, scratching my skin. I needed to find something, anything that would explain why this presence was haunting me. Then, my fingers touched something hard, something buried deep in the earth. I pulled with all my strength and finally unearthed a small wooden box, old, covered in moss and damp from time. I opened the box with shaking hands, and inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. An old photo of Antonio as a child, beside his father. But that wasn't all. The photo was torn in half, and on the missing side, there was a dark stain, something that looked like dried blood. In that moment, I felt a presence behind me, a weight in the air. The wind howled once more, and I thought, he was there, Antonio's father, standing right behind me, waiting for me to understand. And finally, I did. He wasn't haunting me by chance. He wanted justice. He wanted me to reveal something hidden, something that only I could uncover. But what was it? What really happened to Antonio and his father? And what did that photo mean? The feeling that something terrible had been buried along with Antonio's father's body hit me like a wave. And in that moment, I realized that the search for answers was just beginning, and that I was trapped in the middle of this mystery with no way out. It was one of those nights where you just know you're about to do something you'll regret. Me and my buddy Josh were bored out of our minds, and when someone threw out the idea of visiting the old cemetery on the outskirts of town at 3 a.m., well, it didn't take much convincing. "It'll be fun," I said. What could go wrong? Famous last words, right? So there we were, driving down that narrow, winding road, nothing but darkness all around, the headlights cutting through the thick night fog. The cemetery was old, really old. People always talked about it being haunted, about strange noises and shadows moving between the graves. But, of course, we thought it was all just stories. Until we got there. We parked just outside the rusted iron gate, the kind that creaks in horror movies, and as soon as we stepped out of the car, I felt the chill. The kind of chill that isn't just the cold air. It seeps into your bones and makes you feel like something is watching. I shrugged it off, though, not wanting to seem like a wuss in front of Josh. He was already climbing over the low stone wall, laughing, flashlight in hand. "Come on, don't chicken out," he called. So I followed him in, and there we were, standing among rows of crumbling tombstones, some so old the names were worn away. The whole place felt frozen in time, like a snapshot of someone else's nightmare. We walked between the graves, joking around, trying to scare each other, and honestly, for a few minutes it was kind of fun. Just us, the dead, and the eerie silence. Then we heard it, faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. A laugh, a high-pitched giggle like a little girl playing hide and seek. I stopped dead in my tracks, and Josh's smile faded. "You heard that, right?" he asked, looking around trying to find the source. I nodded, my heart pounding louder than it had any right to. There shouldn't have been anyone there but us, and that laugh. It came from the darkness just ahead. "Probably just an animal or something," Josh said, trying to convince himself more than me. But I knew that laugh wasn't any animal. It was too human. I shone my flashlight towards the sound, and I swear I saw something. A small figure darting behind a gravestone, quick like a shadow. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. Just more giggling, this time closer, like it was circling us. Josh and I looked at each other, that silent agreement that we needed to get the hell out of there. We turned and ran back towards the gate, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. Every step felt like something was right behind me, breathing down my neck, reaching out. But when I turned, there was nothing, just darkness and gravestones. We finally got to the car, panting and laughing nervously, trying to shake off the fear. "See? Just some stupid prank," Josh said, pulling out his keys, trying to sound casual. But as we got in, I glanced back at the cemetery one last time and saw something move behind the gate, a shadow slipping away into the night. We drove off, both of us pretending like we weren't scared out of our minds. But then, as we hit the main road, Josh's eyes went wide. "Dude, did you leave the back door open?" he asked. I turned around, and my blood ran cold. The back door of the car was open, just slightly, like someone or something had slipped in. And in that moment, I felt it again. That chill, that feeling that we weren't alone. I felt my stomach drop as I reached back to pull the door shut, my hands trembling. We both sat there for a moment trying to catch our breath, but it felt like the air was being sucked out of the car. "Lock the doors," Josh muttered, and I quickly hit the button, hearing the reassuring click of the locks sliding into place. We sat in silence for a minute, staring straight ahead, the engine idling. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see I don't know, a face, a shadow, something that would make sense of that laugh we heard. But there was nothing, just the empty back seat, staring back at me. "Let's just get out of here," I finally said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Josh nodded and floored it. The tires screeched as we pulled away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. It was like a weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then I heard it, a soft giggle. That same laugh from the cemetery, only this time it was coming from inside the car. I froze, my hands gripping the seat so hard my knuckles turned white. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, not daring to turn around. Josh's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and his face went pale. He nodded slowly, but neither of us moved. The laugh came again, clearer this time. It sounded like it was right behind us, like there was someone in the back seat, just sitting there, waiting. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to keep my eyes forward, to just drive and not acknowledge whatever it was. But I couldn't help myself. My head turned, inch by inch, until I was looking straight at the back seat. Empty. But I could feel something there, something wrong. It was like the air was heavy, thick with presence. And then, as we rounded a corner, my flashlight rolled off the seat and clattered to the floor. I bent down to grab it, and that's when I saw them. Tiny, wet footprints on the carpet. Small, like a child's, leading from the door to the middle of the back seat, and then disappearing as if they just faded away. I felt the blood drain from my face, my mouth going dry. "Josh, the footprints?" I managed to choke out, but before I could finish, something slammed against the window, hard, like a fist pounding the glass. Josh swerved, nearly losing control of the car, and that's when we both saw it, just for a split second, in the corner of the rearview mirror. A small face, pale and ghostly, with wide, unblinking eyes staring back at us, smiling. A face that wasn't there a moment before, and then gone. "Holy sh!" Josh yelled, pulling the car over to the side of the road. We both jumped out, hearts pounding, and looked around frantically. But there was no one. Just the empty road stretching out behind us, and the dark cemetery far in the distance. The car was silent now, the back door shut tight, the windows fogged with our panicked breaths. We just stood there, staring at each other, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. But the more we tried to explain it, the more it felt like the darkness around us was closing in, like we'd brought something back from that cemetery. And it wasn't done with us yet. We stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the car. The night was dead silent now, like the whole world was holding its breath. My ears were ringing from the adrenaline, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I looked at Josh, and he looked back at me, both of us just as clueless and scared. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't just leave the car there, but getting back inside felt like walking straight into a trap. Let's just check it out, okay? Make sure there's nothing weird," I said, my voice barely steady. Josh nodded, but I could tell he wasn't any more confident than I was. We slowly walked around to the back door, the one that had been open. I reached out, and my fingers felt like lead as I grabbed the handle. I pulled it open quickly, like ripping off a Band-Aid, and shined the flashlight inside. The back seat was empty. No footprints, no ghostly figures, no laughing child. Nothing. It was as if whatever had been there vanished without a trace. I let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. Josh was looking at something in the front seat, his face twisted in confusion. "What?" I asked, my voice cracking. He pointed to the dashboard. "Dude, the radio." I looked where he was pointing. The radio was off, the screen blank, but the dial was turning, clicking back and forth between stations like it was searching for a signal. We hadn't even turned the radio on the whole night. My skin crawled as the dial stopped, and the speakers hissed to life, just static at first, but then a faint voice. It was low, barely a whisper, but I could make out a word or two. "Come, play." And then the laugh. That same giggle, louder this time, echoing through the car. I slammed my fist on the power button, but the radio wouldn't turn off. The laugh kept getting louder, filling the car, surrounding us. I could see Josh's face in the glow of the dashboard lights, pale, terrified. "Turn it off, man, turn it off," he shouted. But I was already trying, hitting every button, pulling at the wires. Nothing worked. The voice kept laughing, and then it spoke again, clearer this time, like it was right in our ears. "I see you." And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The radio went dead, the voice was gone, and the car fell silent again. Josh and I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the radio like it might come to life at any moment. And then we heard it, something scratching softly from under the car. Josh looked at me, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. We crouched down, shining the flashlight underneath the car, and I swear I could see something move, just a blur of white, like a dress or a little girl's nightgown. And then, all at once, it was gone. No sound, no shadow, just the empty space under the car. I pulled back, stumbling to my feet, and Josh was already opening the driver's door. "We need to get out of here. Now," he said, and I didn't argue. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off down the road, leaving the cemetery and whatever had followed us behind. But as we drove away, the flashlight I had tossed in the back seat flickered, and just for a split second, I saw the beam of light hit the rearview mirror, and there it was again. That face, grinning back at me. It was just a flash. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, but I know what I saw, and I knew, deep down, that whatever we'd found in that cemetery, it wasn't going to let us go that easily. We drove as fast as we could, not saying a word, just trying to put as much distance between us and that cemetery as possible. The road stretched on forever, and every shadow felt like it was reaching for us, trying to drag us back. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that face again, but it never showed up. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was in the car with us, hiding in that silence. Josh pulled into a gas station, hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. He put the car in park and just sat there, staring straight ahead, breathing heavy. I finally spoke, though my voice felt small, like it didn't belong to me. What do we do now?" He shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "I don't know, man. I don't know what the hell that was. But we gotta figure this out." He turned off the engine, and the car fell into an eerie quiet, like everything was holding its breath. The flickering light from the gas station sign was the only thing breaking the darkness around us. Josh got out to get some air, and I stayed in the car, gripping the seat, trying to calm my breathing. That's when I noticed something. A small, folded piece of paper on the passenger seat. I hadn't seen it there before. It looked old, the edges frayed and yellowed like it had been left there for years. Or maybe like someone had just put it there. With trembling fingers, I reached over and picked it up. When I unfolded it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a drawing, a child's drawing. Crayon on paper. It showed 2 stick figures standing in a graveyard, with a third smaller figure standing behind them. A little girl holding hands with the other 2. And underneath it, written in shaky, childish handwriting, were the words, "Let's play again." I stared at the paper, trying to make sense of it, but my mind felt like it was spinning in circles. How did this get here? Who drew it? I looked out the window to show Josh, but he was gone. He'd been standing right next to the car just a second ago. But now, nothing. I threw open the door, running around the side of the car, shouting his name. "Josh! Josh! Where are you?" The only answer was the sound of the wind rustling through the empty lot. I spun around, my heart pounding, trying to see through the darkness. And then I heard it, coming from behind the car. That same giggle, soft and echoing. "Josh!" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. I stepped closer to the back of the car, the flashlight in my hand shaking so bad I could barely keep it steady. When I finally shined the light on the ground, I saw the footprints. Tiny, wet, child-sized prints, circling around the car, leading away into the dark. I followed them, my breath hitching with every step. The prints went around the side of the gas station, leading to a narrow alley between the building and a wooden fence. And then, as I turned the corner, I saw him, Josh, standing still, staring down at something in his hands. "Josh, what are you doing, man?" I called out, my voice desperate. He didn't respond. He just kept staring down at his hands, like he was in some kind of trance. I walked closer, and that's when I saw what he was holding. Another piece of paper, crumpled and worn. He slowly lifted his head, and when he looked at me, his eyes were wide, almost empty, like he wasn't really there. "It's her," he whispered, holding out the paper for me to see. I reached for it, and as I unfolded it, my heart sank. It was another drawing. The same graveyard, the same stick figures. But this time, the girl was closer, almost like she was moving towards us, and the words scrawled at the bottom read, "You can't leave me." That's when the lights at the gas station flickered, and the giggling started again, louder, circling around us. The wind picked up, and I felt it. That presence, cold and heavy, closing in. I grabbed Josh's arm, pulling him back to the car. "We have to go. Now!" I shouted, but he just stood there, staring at the paper, like he couldn't move. And then, just before I dragged him away, I heard it, whispered right in my ear, close enough that I could feel the breath on my skin. "Stay with me." I spun around, but there was no one there, just the darkness, closing in tighter, and that laugh echoing in the night, as if it was all around us, and right inside my head. I yanked Josh away, my heart racing, and dragged him back to the car, practically throwing him into the passenger seat. "Get it together, man," I yelled as I jumped into the driver's seat. The papers fluttered out of his hands, falling to the ground outside, and I slammed the door shut, locking it like it would somehow keep whatever that was out. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, speeding out of the gas station. But the laughter, it followed us. It wasn't just behind us. It felt like it was inside the car, bouncing off the windows, echoing in our ears. I couldn't see straight, my hands were shaking on the wheel, and all I could think was to get as far away as possible. But the faster we drove, the louder that laugh became, like it was wrapping itself around us, squeezing tighter and tighter. Josh was mumbling to himself, rocking back and forth in the seat. I tried to talk to him, but his eyes were locked on the road ahead, like he was seeing something I couldn't. "She's coming. She's coming. She's with us," he kept repeating over and over, and it was like he wasn't even there with me anymore. I wanted to shake him, snap him out of it, but my eyes kept darting to the mirrors, searching for that face, that ghostly face grinning at us. And then I saw her, in the rearview mirror just for a split second. A small figure, sitting in the back seat, her face turned towards me, her eyes wide and dark, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. She was smiling, no, grinning, at me, and I felt this wave of dread wash over me, like all the warmth in my body drained out at once. I slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road, the tires screeching as we came to a halt. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the back seat, but there was nothing, just empty space. But I knew she had been there. I felt her. I felt those eyes boring into me. "Josh, did you see that?" I shouted, but he just kept rocking, muttering under his breath, not making any sense. And then the giggling started again right next to my ear. I snapped my head to the side, and I swear I felt something brush against my face, like tiny, cold fingers grazing my cheek. I whipped my head around, flashlight swinging wildly, trying to find her, trying to see what was playing this sick game with us. But she was gone, or maybe she was everywhere. We sat there, panting, not knowing what to do. The silence pressed in on us, so thick it was hard to breathe. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the car lights went out, completely. No headlights, no dashboard glow, just darkness. And in that darkness, I heard it, the soft sound of tiny footsteps on the gravel outside, circling the car, getting closer and closer. My hands scrambled to find the keys, to turn the engine back on, but my fingers felt numb, clumsy. Josh started screaming, this raw, terrified scream that seemed to rip out of him, and I didn't even know what he was looking at. All I knew was that whatever was out there, it was closing in on us. Fast. Finally, I got the engine to turn over, and the lights flickered back on. For a split second, I saw her, standing right outside my window. The little girl in a white dress, her face pale and expressionless, but those eyes, they burned with a darkness that I'll never forget. And then, just as quickly, she vanished, like smoke in the wind. I floored it, tires spinning on the gravel before catching, and we sped down the road, not looking back, not daring to slow down. We didn't talk. We didn't breathe. We just drove and drove until the town was far behind us, and the night finally gave way to the first hint of dawn. Even then, when the sun finally came up, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with us, like she'd found a way in, somewhere deep inside, and wasn't going to let us go. And sometimes, even now, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I hear it, that faint, echoing laugh, like she's waiting for me to come back and play. I remember that day so clearly. It was one of those bright, sunny afternoons that feels almost out of place when you're dealing with something heavy. I had gone to the cemetery to visit my grandfather's grave. He passed away about a year before, and I'd been struggling with it ever since. We were close, really close, and I felt like maybe, by going there, I could feel some kind of peace, some sense of closure. So I went alone. Just me, a bouquet of flowers, and the long stretch of quiet gravestones. It was peaceful in a strange way, but that kind of peace that hangs in the air like something waiting to be disturbed. I found his headstone easily, third row, near the old oak tree where he used to love to sit and tell me stories when I was a kid. I sat down, placed the flowers, and started talking to him. You know, like people do. Telling him about my life, how much I missed him, just trying to connect. Felt good, almost like he was listening. I don't know if I believe in all that, but in that moment, I felt like he was there with me, right next to me, nodding along like he used to. The wind was soft, and there was this gentle rustling of leaves that felt comforting. I stayed there for a while, maybe an hour or two, until the sun started dipping lower, and the shadows got long and stretched out over the gravestones. I finally stood up, said my goodbyes, and made my way back to the car. And that's when it happened. I was driving down the old country road that leads out of the cemetery, just me and the open stretch of fields on either side. The radio was off, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something. Just a flash at first, like a quick movement on the side of the road. I slowed down, thinking it was probably just an animal or a trick of the light, but then I saw him. Standing just off the shoulder of the road, right at the edge of the trees, was a man. And not just any man. He looked exactly like my grandfather. The same old coat he used to wear, the same hat pulled low over his eyes. And those eyes, I could see them even from a distance, staring straight at me. I hit the brakes, my heart pounding. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No, it's impossible, I thought. It can't be him. It just can't. But the more I stared, the more I was sure it was him, just standing there, watching me, like he was waiting for something. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, he was gone, just vanished. I sat there in the middle of the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white, my breath coming out in shaky bursts. For a second, I thought I might be losing it, seeing things because I was missing him so much. But then I remembered something he used to say to me whenever I was scared as a kid. "I'm always watching over you," he'd tell me, with that warm smile of his. I tried to tell myself it was a sign, something comforting. But the way he looked at me, the way those eyes bore into mine, it didn't feel comforting. Felt like he was trying to warn me. I drove home in silence. That image burned into my mind. The old coat, the hat, Those eyes. I didn't know what to think, what to believe. And deep down, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, my grandfather wasn't resting as peacefully as I'd hoped. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake that image of him standing by the side of the road. Every time I blinked, I saw his face, those eyes locked onto mine, and I felt this knot of dread in my stomach. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, just a hallucination brought on by the grief. But the way he looked at me, it was too real to ignore. I finally got back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and just sat in the dark living room, trying to piece together what I'd seen. I was running through every logical explanation in my head. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe it was some guy who just happened to look like him. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, that sense of unease wouldn't let go. Then my phone rang. I jumped, my nerves on edge, and glanced at the screen. The number was blocked, just unknown caller, flashing across the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I needed to, that it was important. So I picked up, my voice shaky as I said, "Hello." First, there was nothing. Just static, like the call was coming from some bad connection or somewhere far away. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A faint voice cutting through the static, weak and garbled, but familiar. I strained to make it out, pressing the phone tighter to my ear, my heart racing. It was my grandfather. I knew his voice like the back of my hand, and it was him. Can you hear me?" he whispered, his voice crackling through the static. I froze, felt like my whole world stopped right then. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Grandpa," I said, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" The static grew louder, a screeching sound that made my ears ring. But through it I could hear him clearer now. "I need you to listen." His voice was desperate, like he was struggling to get the words out, like he was calling from someplace he wasn't supposed to be. And I could feel it, that same sense of dread I'd felt on the road, that chill that crawled down my spine. What do you mean?" I stammered. "Listen to what?" Then the phone went dead. Just silence. I pulled it away from my ear, staring at the screen, hoping maybe the call would come back, that he'd say something else. But it was gone like it never happened. I sat there, holding my phone, trying to wrap my head around it. How could he be calling me? He was gone. He'd been gone for a year. And just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call, it was a voicemail. No number, just a message sitting there waiting to be played. My fingers shook as I pressed play, the recording crackling to life. It was him again. His voice was faint, buried under layers of static and noise, but I could hear him clearly enough. "Don't come back," he said, his voice filled with an urgency that sent chills down my spine. "It's not safe." And then, just like that, the message ended. I dropped the phone on the couch, my hands trembling, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure. My grandfather was trying to tell me something important, and whatever it was, it felt like I was only scratching the surface of something much, much darker. I sat there, staring at the phone like it might start talking again. The message replayed over and over in my mind. His voice, that urgency, that warning. "Don't come back. It's not safe." What did he mean? Not come back where? To the cemetery? And why wasn't it safe? None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more my head spun. But the fear, that chill deep in my bones, told me one thing for sure. Whatever was going on, it wasn't good. I tried to shake it off, to calm down. I even tried telling myself that maybe it was just some cruel prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that voice was his. And as the night went on, that sense of being watched, the feeling I'd felt since the cemetery, grew stronger. I started pacing around my apartment, looking out the windows, checking the locks on my doors, expecting to see, I don't know what, his face again. A shadow? I felt like I was losing my mind. I finally sat down, trying to think clearly. Maybe there was an answer in his message. Maybe he was trying to tell me something specific, but my brain was too fried to catch it. I decided to listen to the voicemail again. I picked up the phone, went to the messages, and hit play. Static. Nothing but static. The voice that had been so clear just minutes ago was now buried under layers of noise. Barely a whisper. I cranked the volume up, pressing the phone tight against my ear, straining to hear anything. Any word. Any sound that might explain all this. And that's when I heard it, faintly, in the background. It was like a low hum, almost a growl mixed with whispering, like a bunch of voices all talking at once, layered on top of each other, too distorted to make out. But one word cut through all the noise, so clear that it made my blood run cold. Don't! I dropped the phone, my whole body shaking. That was the word, don't. And it felt like it was meant for me, a direct command. Don't what? Don't listen? Don't go back? My mind raced with questions that only made things worse. And then I heard it, the sound that I will never forget. Knocking. 3 loud, heavy knocks coming from my front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My apartment is on the 2nd floor, and it was well past midnight. There was no reason for anyone to be at my door, not now, not like this. And yet, there it was. Knock, knock, knock. I walked to the door, each step feeling like it took a lifetime. I reached for the peephole, holding my breath, praying that no one would be there, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I closed one eye and peered through, and there he was, my grandfather, standing right outside, looking just like he did that day by the road. Hat pulled low, that same old coat, and those eyes staring straight at me. But there was something wrong. His face, it didn't look right. It was pale, too pale, and his eyes were different. Blank, lifeless, like he was just there. No expression, no movement, just staring at me through the peephole. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and I whispered, "Grandpa?" And then his face moved. Not like a normal person, no, it was like he twitched. Just a quick, sharp jerk of his head, and his mouth opened. And I swear I could hear it, even through the door, even through my panicked breathing. That same whisper, low and chilling, like it was coming from somewhere far away but right in my ear at the same time. "Don't come back." The knock started again, louder, more insistent, and my whole body went cold. I backed away from the door, trying to think, trying to breathe. And then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence. I waited, listening for any sign that he was still out there. I didn't dare open the door. I just stood there, trembling, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And somewhere in that silence, I realized something. I didn't know if the thing on the other side of that door was really my grandfather, or something else wearing his face. I stayed there, back pressed against the wall, staring at the door, too scared to even blink. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Call someone? Open the door and see if he was still there? But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor, and all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Minutes passed, felt like hours, and finally, I forced myself to peek through the peephole again. The hallway outside was empty. No one was there. No sign of my grandfather, no sound of footsteps walking away. Just silence, thick and heavy. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that whatever I'd seen was gone. Or maybe it was never really there. But deep down, I knew better. That voice, those eyes, I couldn't make that up. And I knew he'd come for a reason. He was trying to tell me something, and that's when it hit me, his warning. Don't come back. He didn't want me to go back to the cemetery. But why? What was he so desperate to keep me away from? That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought it was just my nerves making me feel nauseous, but then it grew stronger. A sharp, pungent scent, like rotting flowers mixed with earth. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, filling the entire apartment, getting so strong I could almost taste it. I covered my nose and mouth, trying not to gag, and walked around, searching for the source. When I reached the living room, I froze. The bouquet of flowers, the one I'd brought to my grandfather's grave earlier that day. It was lying on the floor, petals scattered across the carpet. But it wasn't just that. The flowers, they were black, completely withered and decayed, as if they'd been rotting for weeks. And I knew for a fact they'd been fresh when I brought them home. My mind was spinning, trying to piece it all together. I bent down, staring at those blackened flowers, and that's when I felt it. A gust of cold wind, blowing through the room, chilling me to the bone. But all the windows were shut. There was nowhere for the wind to come from. Then a sound, soft at first like fabric dragging across the floor, but getting closer. I spun around, and there in the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow, dark and low, moving along the wall almost like a stain that was alive. And as I watched, it began to grow, stretching up the wall, taking form. The room went icy cold, and I knew I needed to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was rooted to the floor, trapped in place as the shadow reached the ceiling and started to spill down toward me. And then, I saw a shape within it. A figure. It was like looking at a reflection in black water, rippling and swirling but taking on the unmistakable outline of a person. My breath caught in my throat, and all I could do was watch as that figure stretched its hand out towards me, long and twisted, like fingers clawing through the dark. "Don't!" The voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Some male, some female, all distorted, all wrong. And they were all saying the same thing. "Don't come back." I stumbled backwards, my foot catching on the coffee table, and fell hard to the floor. My head was spinning, my heart racing, and I could barely see straight. All I knew was that I needed to get away, get out of that apartment, but the shadow was closing in, swallowing the room around me, the voices growing louder and louder until it felt like they were coming from inside my head. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and bolted for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, the cold metal slipping through my trembling hands. I yanked the door open, and for a split second, I thought I felt something grab my wrist. A cold, tight grip that burned like ice. But I didn't look back. I just ran, down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the night air, and didn't stop until I was far away from that building, far away from whatever had come for me. And in the darkness, as I stood there, shaking and gasping for breath, I realized the truth. My grandfather's warning wasn't just to keep me away from the cemetery. It was to keep me away from them, from whatever darkness was tied to that grave. And now, it had found me. I ran until my legs ached and my lungs burned, the cold night air cutting into my throat with every gasping breath. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away, far away from my apartment, from the shadow, from whatever that thing was that had crawled into my life. Eventually, I found myself on a quiet side street, leaning against the brick wall of a closed-up shop, trying to steady myself. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The phone call, the smell, the shadow. My grandfather's face at the door. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it, and tried to call someone. Anyone. I scrolled through my contacts, but I couldn't think straight. What would I even say? "Hey, I think my dead grandfather is haunting me, and there's a shadow trying to drag me into God knows where?" Yeah, that would go over real well. That's when the phone buzzed again. A notification. Another voicemail. My heart sank as I saw it. It was from unknown caller again. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. Part of me knew I shouldn't listen to it, that nothing good would come from it. But a stronger part of me, call it curiosity, call it desperation, needed to know. I needed to hear what the voice had to say. So I hit play. The static came through immediately, even louder than before, hissing and popping like a storm. But underneath it, I could hear that voice again. My grandfather's voice, struggling to come through. "Danger? Don't trust." It was broken up, almost impossible to understand, but then it cut clear for just a second. "You have to stop them." And then another voice cut in, a deeper, growling voice, one that wasn't my grandfather's. It was like hearing an animal try to speak, low and guttural, and it made my skin crawl. "You belong to us." The phone got hot in my hand, burning my palm, and I dropped it on the ground, the voicemail still playing. The voices were overlapping now, screaming, whispering, laughing. All at once, filling the quiet street with that horrible, haunting sound. I wanted to smash the phone, to silence it, but I was frozen in place, staring down as the voices reached a fever pitch, and then stopped. The screen went black, and in that silence, I heard something else. Not from the phone. From behind me, the faintest sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. My whole body tensed, and I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty street, dimly lit by the flickering streetlights. But then I spotted it. A figure at the far end of the street, standing still, too still, like they were waiting for me. I couldn't make out who it was, but as I stared, they started to move. Slowly at first, just one step at a time, but then faster, coming straight towards me. And as they got closer, I saw the face. My grandfather. But it wasn't him, not really. It was like something wearing his face, the features distorted and twisted, the eyes hollow and black. And that grin, that awful wide grin stretched too far across his face. "Grandpa," I whispered, but my voice barely came out. I wanted to run, to get away, but my legs felt like lead. And all I could do was watch as the figure drew closer and closer, the smile never wavering. And then, when he was just a few feet away, he stopped, cocked his head to the side, and spoke in a voice that wasn't his. A voice that sounded like a dozen voices all layered on top of each other. "You let them in." A chill ran through me, and my mouth went dry. What do you mean?" I stammered, but I already knew. Somehow, I'd brought this darkness to me. I'd let it into my life, and now it wouldn't let go. He took another step, and I felt this force. Cold, heavy, pressing against my chest, like invisible hands reaching for me. "They'll never let you go," he whispered, his voice cracking and splintering. And then his eyes, those empty, black eyes, they started to bleed. Dark, thick liquid ran down his cheeks, dripping to the ground, and I felt like I was sinking, like the world around me was closing in. I backed away, trying to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. And then, everything went black. The world disappeared, and I was just falling into that darkness, into that void, where all I could hear were those voices, calling my name, laughing, whispering that one word over and over. Don't. And then I hit the ground, hard. I woke up on the street, the sun rising, my phone lying beside me, cracked and silent. The figure, my grandfather or whatever it was gone. But the feeling wasn't. That cold, hollow feeling in my chest, like something had followed me, like it was still with me, still watching. And I knew, deep down, that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always find me, because I had let them in. And now they were never going to leave.